Welcome back as we continue to look at how to read the Bible, how to study the Bible. Today we're looking at the New Testament letters. Now, today we live in a world with a whole lot of communication options. You can email, you can text, you can message, you can fax, all these different things you can do to communicate with one another, in addition to phone calls and video chats and Zoom meetings and all these different things, ways to communicate with one another, right? Well, the letters in the New Testament are a way that Paul or James or Peter or John were communicating. These individuals were communicating with the body of believers in the world, and it's really, they are some of the most popular things. You look at Bible studies done on them, and there's tons of Bible studies on the letters in the scriptures, sermons, and just the way we like to study these letters. And there's a lot of reasons for that. As you read those letters, they seem to speak to us in a more direct way, because these letters are dealing with specific issues at specific places, but they are dealing with stuff, directly communicating, this is how you should do things, this is how you should live, this is how to do this is what this means, this is how, and so it kind of feels natural. We may have a lot of ways to communicate, but most of us still know what a written letter is. And even if you don't, you certainly know what an email is, which functions pretty well along the same lines. You've sent that. So it's familiar to us. And as we read these letters, they speak to us and resonate with us in a different way. They make us comfortable. And it also is true that it makes us think that we understand them, but we have to be kind of careful with these letters. It's not as straightforward as it seems when we read these letters, because we have that tendency to just look at it, as we do with all of Scripture, to just look at it through our lens, through our perspective. And we've got to be careful with that. First off, I want you to give you a little background on letter writing. Because we think of a letter and we think of, a guy sitting down at a desk, whatever, sitting down at a desk, grabbing a pen, grabbing a piece of paper, and whipping out a letter. And even one that they're really poring over, they whip that letter out in a few hours, and away they fold it up, put it in an envelope, stick a stamp on it, and away it goes. And a few days later, day two, whatever, depending on how far it is, a little while later, they get that, they rip that open, and they read this letter that this person wrote. But that's not how letter writing worked in the ancient world there. First off, it wasn't common or easy to write letters. Certainly not as easy as it is today. Materials were expensive, and so typical letters were really short. If you wanted a long letter, like some of the New Testament letters, or Romans, or 1 Corinthians, or some of these longer letters, what you had to do was you had to take multiple pieces of papyrus, or some of these others. Usually it was papyrus at the time of the New Testament. And you would have to actually combine them, sew them together to make a scroll. And as you do these, it means that typical letters were really short. Think Philemon. When you look at Philemon, that was about the length of a typical letter that you would normally have written. Right? And a letter the size of 1 Corinthians, just to give you a little perspective, at that time in their value, to produce that letter would probably have cost around $2,100. That's $2,100. It wasn't a cheap, easy process to do that. Right? So we need to understand, this was not something they undertook on the spur of the moment. This was something when you were writing that letter, you really felt you needed to communicate that with, you needed to communicate with them, and what you were writing, you gave a lot of thought, a lot of effort went into this. So it's not just something that was casually done. They really did put a lot of effort, a lot of thought to produce these. Also, letter writers often used an amanuensis or secretary in those days and age. And in fact, in Romans 16:22, we see a reference, Tertius, who wrote this. So we know that Paul used one. And why would they use one? Why? Well, if you've ever seen my handwriting, you'd know why. You wanted somebody that could write small letters very clearly. Think calligraphy type letters. Think that they're writing very clearly, something that can easily be read and understood. Not something that, I write, even when I do painstakingly slow, taking my time, it's just not really clear. It's not a beautiful script that just flows from my hand. And so a lot of times these guys would use these individuals, and those individuals would be able to produce a very high quality script that's easily read, easily understood, and they would be responsible for procuring the materials, the ink that's going to be used, the paper or papyrus or skin vellum or whatever's going to be used to make this. They're responsible for getting all of that together and preparing all of that, and then they're going to sit there and they're going to write down what's dictated to them. So you can see Paul, instead of sitting at a desk writing away, you see Paul perhaps standing, pacing, thinking through what he's saying, going over it. You didn't want to make a mistake. You went over this multiple times before it was written down, because it's really expensive. And if you make a mistake, you can't just erase it and walk away. So it was very expensive. They used other people to write a lot of times. And a lot of care and a lot of forethought went into what they were putting down, the letter they were crafting, so that they would then, be able to communicate effectively and faithfully, and that what they were trying to. And I think that's one of the reasons that these letters are in the scriptures the way they are, is because God was moving in these men to write these things, and a lot of time and a lot of effort went into writing these, and they weren't just common things that somebody just put down. There was a reason behind them, and a lot of thought went into them. But it's also true, we think of a letter, something I drop in a mailbox and it disappears, or I take it to the post office and stick it in a slot and it disappears, and a while later it's delivered and somebody rips it open and reads it. But in the old days, in that time period, there's no postal service. There's not even a Pony Express. If you want to send a letter, then you had to have someone deliver that letter in person, right? So someone's going along, this person is going to there, so Paul's going to write a letter to Ephesus or to Rome or to Corinth. He has someone that he trusts, and he entrusts this letter to them, and they carry that letter with them. And when they get to that church, you need to understand that they didn't just deliver the letter. What would happen is this person would then read the letter. If it's to a congregation, some are to individuals like Philemon or Timothy, but in general they're mostly to congregations. But whether it's a congregation or an individual, they would then read that letter, all of it, to the individual, with the idea that they are going to be able, if there's any questions, any discussion, anything they're not clear on, then that person can clarify. That person can interpret what's there. Okay? And a lot of times I wish those people were here with us, because some of the stuff that's written in there, it's controversial. We don't understand it because it's not written to us that way. Right? So when we're looking at these, we need to understand this process. It wasn't something that you just undertook the way we undertook, to write a letter or send an email. And it's sent out, and it had a huge impact because this person took enough time and spent enough money and provided a way for them to communicate clearly with you. Right? Some things to remember when you read these letters, when we're reading the New Testament letters, is that, first off, the letters were meant to be read in one single setting. Right? They were read in a community, and they were discussed at the time of the reading with the individual who's delivering that letter, so that if there's questions, that person can explain it, because he already has gone over this with the writer, be it John or Peter or Paul or whomever. They've gone over it with this individual. They know what the person's trying to say, and they can come, and if there's anything they're not sure about, they can explain it. Right? So it's meant to be one seamless letter. It's not meant to do the way we do. We pick out a couple of verses here, or we start the letter and I read this chapter, and then the next day I read, and it ends up taking me a week, or some of these several weeks, to read the letter. It's one seamless letter, and so that means that there's themes going through these letters, and when you read it as a whole, it helps you understand the themes and understand the letter better than when we just break it up or just read a small part. So it's a seamless letter. Second, you need to remember these letters were not written to you. Right? They weren't written to you. They were written for a person or a group of people that were at a specific time, in a specific location, and were dealing with specific issues and had a specific set of circumstances around them. So when we're reading these letters, we need to understand Paul wasn't writing this necessarily, or Peter or John or James, they weren't writing this with you in mind. They had a specific group of readers in mind, and that doesn't mean that the letter isn't applicable to us today. It absolutely is, but it's not written for you, and so you can't just read it and put yourself in that place where this was written to me and everything here exactly as it's written applies to me. Right? So remember, it's not written to you. It's not written to you. Second, or third, the letters are only half of a conversation. You ever been standing there and you're listening to somebody talk on the phone, and you're trying to figure out what they're talking about, because all you can hear is one side of the conversation. Most of these letters are written as part of a dialogue that's going on. Whether it's someone asks a question or they're written in response to a specific set of circumstances that's going on. For example, this church is dealing with this specific issue, and so this letter is written to that church. With John, 1 John, they're dealing with a heresy, and he is writing that in large part simply to bring about an understanding of the church's position in regards to what this heresy is saying and being taught. So we can see these things and begin to understand that they have a lot going on in there, but we don't get all of it. We don't have the other letter that asks the questions that, say, Paul is answering when he's writing to the Corinthians. Whether it was a letter or it was an individual that came and just communicated those issues with him, don't know. We don't have it. So we have to read it and kind of guess a little bit. And so we got to look at context, right? So how do we read these letters? How do we look at them? Well, first off, you want to have a roadmap. Anybody ever driven somewhere? And today we're going to take out the phone and we're going to punch in the address and it's going to tell us. It used to be GPS. And before that, the physical maps. You want a roadmap. You want something that's going to give you an idea what you're talking about. Okay, so I'm going to tell you there are different places you can get those. First off, a good commentary is going to give you a lot of that information. So you have your contents and it talks about it. Introduction talks about, this one gives you a good map, and then it gives you an outline of the book, and then it introduces you to it and talks about the themes, the author, all of that stuff with some of those questions. A good study Bible. A good study Bible is an incredible tool. And this study Bible, as you can see, it starts off right at the beginning. This is the letter to Romans. And just like that book, that commentary is on the letter to Romans. And it gives you information about who wrote it, why they wrote it, where they wrote it, where they sent it. And then it gives you an outline of how this is broken down. And it lets you see how the major headings, that a whole big section falls under this heading, and you can begin to look at that. Also, Bible dictionaries that you can look up, and you can see this book of the Bible, and it'll have a couple of paragraphs talking about that. And so these are just 3 of the tools. There's other tools. There are specific studies that are out there that are on a specific book of the Bible. Right? And so as we look at those, have some of these that kind of give you a roadmap so you can tell where this is going, so that it familiarizes you. You know the structure of this letter. You know why it was written. You know what it's trying to communicate. And you can do that. Also, a great way to help yourself with that, especially with most Bibles, the way they're written, is to skim the letter. Don't read it in detail first. Just skim it. You look at those headings, or so that you see the different sections, and you kind of get a feel for how this letter flows, how it's going, right? And so that can help. And you need to understand there's forms that letters follow, right? Usually there is an introduction. For example, in the book of Romans, as we look at Romans, you'll see that for Paul, the way he wrote this is the first 15 verses of the book of Romans are basically introducing this letter. Okay, so they're talking about, Paul, a slave of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle and singled out for God's good news, which he promised long ago. Right, so he's telling them who's writing it and just giving some information there. And then there is a transition, and that transition is very, very important, because that transition kind of gives you the theme for the letter. What is following. This is what we're going to expound on, what we're going to talk about. And in Romans, that is verses 16 and 17. And it says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is God's power for salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and also the Greek. For in it God's righteousness is revealed from faith to faith, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." So what do we see? What is this letter about? Well, first off, it is about the saving power of the gospel message and about how we are to live by faith. If we are right with God, if we are righteous, right in the eyes of God, then we are going to live by faith, and that righteousness is revealed through our faith. Right? And so then you look at it, and the very next thing as it gets into it is the guilt of the Gentile world. Why do we need the gospel? The guilt of it, from idolatry to depravity. And as you continue to go through it, and it expounds on this thing, the need for the gospel message, and how that should impact our lives if we have accepted Christ, how we are then to live that faith. Excuse me. Right? So what you're going to have is usually there's an introduction, there is a transition point, 1 to a section of verses. And then following that is the main body of the letter, which is going to expand on that theme that is introduced. And so when you identify that theme, it really does, it helps you understand what we're talking about when it comes, right? So, and then you have the body expounding on that, followed by a conclusion. Concluding the letter, often there's a prayer for the individuals, or greetings from all these different associates of the individual, these different things, but it concludes the letter and brings it to an end. So what we saw there is the theme of Romans is that the gospel is God's power for salvation. And so we see that he will expound and look at the need for it, and that you can't do it. It's not up to just being born a Jew. It's the gospel message, accepting Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, and then following that up with the fact that if you have accepted Christ, then the righteous are going to live out their faith. They're going to live by that faith. Now, understand, it does mean you're going to have to do some research. There's context here. There's reasons this is written. And so you have to understand that these letters are written in a certain context, certain time period, certain area. And we need to understand that what's going on if you're truly going to be able to read that. And you're going to be able to apply it correctly. So you have to ask some questions. Who wrote this? Who is the author of this? Find these things out. Who was it written to? Is it a specific church? Is it an individual? Is it what? Who was this written to? Right? When was it written? Because that can tell us some things. When was this written? Is this written, in the 50s, or is this written in the 90s? Where is this written? When is it written? Why was it written? What was the occasion for writing? Right? What were the circumstances of its writing? Okay? For example, when you're looking at Timothy, and especially 2 Timothy, Paul's in prison. He doesn't know how much longer he's got. And so he's giving some final instructions to Timothy, both about how he is to serve the Lord and be a leader in that church, but also some final instructions. Please bring my papers, bring this, send this. He is, and come before winter. Right, and so final instructions there. And so what's going on, right? And what is the cultural setting that's going on? What, if it's written to a specific city, what's going on in that city? What is all this stuff? And then what questions are being addressed? And as you skim through, you can kind of see, well, there's a theme here. It's talking about moral issues, or it's talking about how to live your life for Christ, or it's talking about salvation, or and you can kind of get things. What questions are being answered? Well, how do you live? Right? So we want to look at all these things, ask these questions so that we get an idea of what's going on in this letter. And then when you're dealing with specific passages in a letter, we've already got the overall theme of the letter. We found that. We know who wrote it and who it's written to and kind of what's going on. General themes, right? So then we're going to look at a specific passage. Well, here's some questions for you to ask. First off, when you're looking at a specific passage, ask, what is the issue? What is going on in this passage? Maybe it's the introduction, and the deal going on is Paul is introducing who he is and that he's writing this, or maybe even introducing the person that is carrying the letter to him. So you see it's a topic, a specific topic. What is the issue? What's going on? What's going on in this? And then we need to know, is there cultural significance or religious significance to this? To what's going on there? Because a lot of times that dictates how we view something. And then you want to ask yourself, right, what is the general principle that's being addressed in this passage. Sometimes we have a tendency to take the letters, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to take this letter, and I just want to go, well, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't apply to me today. It's just dealing with issues back then. Or sometimes we try the opposite, and we try and, we got to operate according to the letter of the law here in this letter. It says we have to do it exactly this way. We got to do it exactly this way, And the thing is, that letter wasn't written with us in mind. What is the general principle? What is the thing this is addressing? The thing behind it. For example, in 1 Corinthians 11, 1 through 16, what you see is, really 2 through 16, what you see is instructions about head coverings. Now I praise you because you always remember me and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you, but I want you to know that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of the woman, and God is the head of Christ. And every man who prays or prophesies with something on his head dishonors his head, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since that is one and the same as having her head shaved. And it goes on, and it talks about it, talking about these various things, and we look at that and we go, my goodness, does that mean that what's going on here? Does that mean that women can't come to church? They can't worship? They can't participate in church if they're not wearing a hat? What? And then we start to look, and we start to see both the cultural and the religious context there. For the Jewish people, a married woman would have her hair longer and it would be bound up, and a single woman would have her hair flowing loosely, and it would be a sign to everybody that she is single. She's not married or engaged, betrothed, or anything like that. She is single. But a married woman would have her hair bound up. And it's also true that in some of the pagan religions, so is there a religious context? That was a cultural thing. Is there a religious context? Well, some of the pagan religions, the women would let their hair down as part of the worship of that deity. Other times, they're culturally, and it may have been the place that way in Corinth, somebody that had their hair cut short, it signified something. Signified it was either used in pagan worship, that is how the priestesses would cut their hair sometimes, or depending on what they were worshiping, but it also had a symbolic nature, is because shaving that head, cutting that hair short there, in some areas, that was a signal that this woman was under indictment for adultery, or was associated with other sexually immoral acts such as lesbianism or just sexual activity outside of marriage, or prostitution or something like that. And so when Paul's addressing this, he's not talking to us about whether we should so we got to look, what's the general principle? What is Paul worried about? Paul is worried about the image they were projecting, how they were doing their hair, how they were dressing and doing this stuff. What was the message that was being sent? And when you look at that and you understand that, then today, culturally, it doesn't send that same message, so it doesn't necessarily mean that you got to go with your head covered, but it does say, what message are you sending? By how you're dressing, by how the makeup you're wearing, how you're doing your hair, whatever you're doing. Is it a tattoo? What message are you sending with that tattoo? Is it piercings? What message are you sending with those piercings? How do we do things? What is the message we are sending? And so when we look at that and we understand that, we can take those general principles and apply that to our lives. We say that, well, how do I take that general principle that said, you need to be careful of the image you are projecting to other people. Because as a follower of Jesus Christ and coming into worship, you need to make sure that you are sending the right message. So how do I apply that? Man, I take it and I go, well, in my life, what message am I sending by the clothes I'm wearing? What message am I sending by these things, right? What message is printed out on my shirt or printed out on my hat, or the things I say? What is the message I'm sending, right? So what we want to do is we want to remember that as we're reading these, they are human, and humans haven't changed that much. So there's going to be stuff here that is very clearly, straight, one-on-one, it applies to us. And there's going to be some other stuff that culturally, it just doesn't apply, but the general principles behind it are still going to be very applicable to us. And so we need to understand that as we read these and as we look at these, we've got to know what's going on. We've got to know why this is here, what's going on, and how we can deal with those things. What's the principle? It will still apply. And then as we read these, we've looked at the context. We know who's writing it, why it's written, where it's written to, what's going on. We've learned a little bit about the context of the general principles behind things and what's going on in that city or with that individual, or what have you. Then when we read these, when we come to this Bible and we are reading these scriptures, we come to it with a new appreciation that says, I am expecting God to speak to me. And it's an adventure I'm on. It's an amazing thing. And as I read these things, Paul or John or James or Peter, or doesn't matter, Jude, any of these, God is moving through them to speak into my life, and God will transform me if I will allow it. So we need to come to the Holy Scriptures with an excitement that says, God is here, and He is going to move, and He is going to speak to me, and we allow Him to speak to us, and we allow Him to say what He wants to say. And sometimes it's going to be a straightforward one-on-one bam application, and sometimes we've got to dig a little deeper to understand what it is He's trying to say to us. But through all of it, God's Spirit will move in us, and when we seek Him, His Spirit will make these things clear to us, and we can understand it. And so as you look at these, understand they took incredible pains to write these letters, and those letters were for the church of that day, but God also moved in those people writing them, and they can speak to us today. So read those letters with excitement and wonder, and just allow God to bless you as you're studying these letters and studying the message God has for you. So let's pray, and we'll finish. Father God, I thank you. You're an amazing, amazing, amazing God. And I just pray that you will help us to love you and serve you faithfully, but above all, that as we read and study your holy scriptures, that you will speak through them in a mighty way, that we may know how to live faithfully, righteously, that we may live out our faith for you and be an incredible blessing to those around us. We love you, Lord God, and we thank you. In Jesus' mighty and holy name we pray.